Well, I would like you to look at this text that Charles gave us in Acts chapter 4. And I'm going to do something with you this morning that's a little bit different. Instead of preaching on the text, I'm going to look at the text and then look at everything in time and space around the text that wants to be like the text and can't be like the text. And I'm going to show you why. In other words, we're going to go through all of literature, history, philosophy, and psychology in 40 minutes, okay? And I want you to act interested, however you can. But I can, obviously, when we look at verse 32 through 35, we would say that is a marvelous thing. The congregation believed, one heart, one soul. No one claimed anything belonging to him was his own. All things common property. Verse 33, abundant grace is on them all, not a needy person. All who were owners of land, houses, sell and bring the proceeds of the sale, lay them at the apostles' feet, be distributed to any as might have need. You know, in the earlier paragraph, there was great blessing spiritually poured out by the power of God to give them grace to keep preaching the gospel. And we saw that, people coming to faith. But what you see in 33 through 2, 3, 4, and 5 is there was a great grace poured out, not just outside of the church and ministering, but within the church. In the parable of Jesus, we're to be a mustard seed that grows huge. We spread out, but we're also the parable of the leaven. The woman hid in 3 pecks of meal, and inwardly it was sweetened. The church goes outward and inward. Here they go outward, and right here they're going to go inward. That the church is not meant just to be a great evangelistic organization that goes out into the world. It's meant to become something that becomes dynamic within. And just a couple of things right here. Not only is there ministerial boldness, there is spiritual grace, and it's a very practical grace. It's not that they love in word or they love in or word only, but they love in deed and in truth. If I got $1, you got $1. It's what it comes down to. So this is real love. And the people, if you know your Old Testament, you might have read 33, 2 through 35 and said, I've seen that before. Those are commanded in the Old Testament family of God of how you treated the poor in Israel. The problem was that they never got that kind of treatment. Do this and that, the law commands, but gives me neither feet nor hands. A different word the gospel brings. It bids me fly, then gives me wings. And so it's an Old Testament framework of love in the family, but the Old Testament guys ended up robbing widows' houses and seizing their houses. Here, the church lives out the new covenant of God placing love for him and love for your brother. By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, that you have love. You notice in 32 through 35, nobody commanded that they do that. Why did they do it? Not because they had to, but because they had to. They did it because of love. When a brother was hurting, they took care of him. It wasn't commanded. It wasn't legislated. They simply came and laid it at the apostles' feet, and they gave it away. This 32 through 35 is the utopia of all of man's political, philosophic, psychological, educational, economic longings. Everybody wants 32 through 35. It's been said that in America, we didn't have a national religion. Everybody can be what they want. And as the country grew and you saw guys that made the decision not to go to church, America invented the broadness of social groups. The Elks, the Odd Fellows, the Mooses, the Grand Poobahs, whatever, you know. The Optimists, the Kiwanis, the Lions, sports, for that matter. Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, everybody in America became a joiner, because if you don't have a church, you better have something that's going to give that type of love. We're all desperate to find this somewhere. Well, this text is an island in a world of turmoil that can't find this. We're the only guys who can do this. I'd like to give you illustrations of this text, but I can't. The only time you can come close to finding it is when men are in combat, that they'll look out for the guy next to them. And maybe in a domestic family, you can find this. In our family, whenever one of us 4 boys was in need, all of us jumped to. Nobody told us, but we did it because it was family. And we're all looking for this. So you just stay with me here and act interested, okay? Because I'm going to have ushers come down with sticks and just thump you if you go to sleep. Just listen to this. If you go back to the early societies after the flood, the Sumerians in the land of Babylon, the ancient Babylonians, the Egyptians, you know how they kept a unanimity to the cultures? The king was seen as God, as a representation of God. Ra, the sun god, was made manifest in Ramses of Egypt. In the Aztec community, the Incas, the Mayas. Matter of fact, a lot of times when the head guy, the king, would die, they would sacrifice his servants to him. They would die with him, and they were offered up. But so all the society existed for that guy. He was the have, they were the have-nots. And he kind of brought an order to the society. The only problem is that he was a fallen human being. And so those societies, those autocracies of one guy ruling it, they all fell apart because the guy was just a fallen sinner, like the Montezumas of his day and the like. So it didn't work. Like in Egypt, was there a time that he could say, I want all the babies killed? He could. And so the society didn't work. But it was the attempt to bring some kind of unity to it. Right after the flood, you see in Genesis 10 a fellow named Nimrod who establishes a kingdom, then branches out, everybody's underneath him. And we're going to build a tower into heaven. We're going to make a name for ourselves. We're going to be gods right here on earth, okay? And so it doesn't work. If man doesn't have a God, he's going to make himself one. And then you got some real problems, see? And so Egypt, Assyria, they tried Babylon. You remember what Nebuchadnezzar did? I'm going to make an image of me. And what does everybody have to do? Everybody's got to bow. We're going to have a unity of ideas. Doesn't work. But that's what they tried. They're looking for this kind of communal society, but they couldn't force it. Then you go to like everything moves to the west, to the Greeks. All of society in those early days was perched on the Mediterranean. Aristotle said like frogs around a pond, and they were. And there was a group of folks in a place called Greece, and it was mountainous, so they didn't have a sense of a national empire. They had little cities tucked into those mountains, and they were called city-states. Athens, Sparta, they were city-states. And you couldn't depend on a national army. You had to take care of yourself if you got in trouble. And so what was very amenable to those cultures was what was called democracy, where everybody was bound together and had a voice. And they found out these were your first great warriors, were the Greek warriors. You know why? They discovered that men would fight for country and family better than they would fight by a king ordering them. Any of you ever see the movie The 300? Okay. Did you notice the difference between Persia and the Spartans? The Spartans were fighting for the guy next to them because that's your home and your family. The Persians were fighting for that king who made himself God. Incidentally, in World War II, they found the same thing out. Guys wouldn't fight as much for an autocrat commanding them as they would for citizen soldiers around them. That's why America won the thing. Because a democracy will make you fight better for your family, for your loved ones, for your nation. And so that was Greece, democracy. Then you had the Romans that took over, and they needed to have an equanimity because that empire was so broad. Incidentally, when the Greeks spread out under Alexander, it fell apart because now they didn't have that sense of unity. The Romans invented what was called the Pax Romana. Remember that test question that you failed? All right. Remember what the Pax Romana was? It was, how do you come up with law if you don't have a supreme being? Try it sometimes. It's not easy. But the Romans came up with a law that bound the society together called the Peace of Rome, that there were rights. But the society, it couldn't go deep enough. All it would do was try to keep lawlessness out of you and keep everybody on the same page. You had the patricians and the plebeians. You ever heard of those? The patricians were the rich guys. And they were called, the word patris means father, patri. And so the patricians were guys that were born into a father's household. Down here, the plebes were born into farmers and to tradesmen. And so these guys ruled. Before the Caesars, the Romans had a senate, and they were governed by the senile. That's what the word means, all right. The ancients, the seniles, the senators, and they would govern the deal. But you still had patricians and plebes. And what they used to say was, the way that you kept, because these guys paid the taxes to keep these guys controlling them. Sound familiar? Okay. These guys paid for these guys to control them. They didn't vote them in. They were born in to what was called the excellent class, the aristocracy. And these guys up here always said that the way to keep them paying taxes was to give them bread and circuses. Just give them food and to give them entertainment. Is that still used? And if we'll just keep them quiet by entertaining them. So that's what they did. The problem was that society had no theological base to it. And in time, it imploded. And so that was the Romans. Incidentally, the Roman and the patricians always felt that it was dishonoring to work. They wanted to be paid by taxes. And working with your hands was considered dishonoring. And the New Testament church said everybody should work with their hands, that it's an honoring thing. There was a guy at this time that saw what was happening, the aristocracy, the patricians, the lower class that paid taxes, and there was no love and there was no unity. As a matter of fact, there got to be, once the Caesars took over, there was great abuse. Rome failed. Greece, in time, it broke down. Egypt failed. They all wanted this, but they couldn't do it. And there was a guy that rose up. Have you ever heard of the writer, the Roman writer Virgil? Virgil was a guy, if you want some of the greatest reading, go get a little piece that Virgil wrote called, and I'm not sure how you pronounce it in Latin, it's spelled G-I-O-G, let's see, G-I-O-R-G-I-A-S, Gorgias. And it means the farmer. I think that's what the word George means, is a farmer. And he wrote about the nobility of the man that works with his hands. I've never read anything that good. And it made you want to quit what you're doing and go plant something, all right? Because he was trying to remedy it. And say, a lot of times the guys that remedy stuff are the artists that are thinking a little bit more sensitive. And he said, this is wrong. These little guys down here, y'all remember the fellow who said that the gentleman farmer is the highest of all occupations? It was Thomas Jefferson. And he said, these are the guys that keep us alive, are the farmers. Jefferson, Gorgias, Virgil, Willie Nelson, these guys that are taking care of the farm. All right. Well, are you with me so far? Everybody's trying to bring equality, liberty, fraternity, trying to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony before Coke. Okay. That's what we all wanted. After the Roman Empire fell, all the tribesmen, all the white boys came in, all right. All the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Jutes and the Angles and the Huns and the Lombards and the whatever, they all came into the empire and they became Romans, okay? And they would then kind of coagulate into what would be France and Spain and Portugal and all the modern states and our nations in time. But what they developed was a way to keep unity whenever they came in, and when the barbarian invasion was like the Oklahoma land rush, okay? They all came and got what were called landed. That was the greatest possession you could have, was land. Now, they had a word for land back then. It was called a feud. And so this is why out in Kentucky, West Virginia, they have these squabbles called feuds over the land, over who gets the still and who doesn't. Right there, okay. And so feudalism, you ever heard that term? The guys that were landed, that got there first, they became the princes, the kings, the whatever, the dukes, the earls, and then you lived on their property. They provided you food. You provided them military service. You had kings and servants. Give me a one-syllable word of what we called them. Serfs. They became serfs. There was a game that came around at this time called chess. Kings, queens, bishops, knights, castles, pawns. And so that was feudal or landed society. The coin of the realm was dirt. Not like in the Roman Greek days that you had coinage. They didn't have coinage. Not till later. They bartered a pig for a chicken, okay? That's how you did work, and that was feudal society. Everybody's bound to the land. Did it bring us Acts 4? It didn't. It tried. You ever seen Downton Abbey? Well, England still has a sense of this. These guys were encouraged by these guys being noble. These guys made sure these guys flourished because it made them look good. And so that kind of bound it together. Everybody knew their place. As a matter of fact, true story, in Downton Abbey, there's a guy on the set that his job is to continually comment on Edwardian England as to there's a certain, like when you met somebody in Edwardian England, when you still had essentially feudalism in place. Do you tip your hat? Do you doff your hat? Do you touch your hat? Or do you nod? Well, maybe, maybe not. It depends who you are and who this guy is. And so it was kind of the remnants of a feudal society. You know what, though? Late Middle Ages, it broke down. And here's why. About 4 reasons. Number one, you had tradesmen arose that didn't need land. They could do a service. They didn't need the land anymore. Because as industry grew and evolved, they could work with leather, precious metals. They could work with iron. They could work with wood. So I didn't need to till the land anymore. I could do what was called a service or provide a good. And secondly, you got what was called now not a pig or a chicken, you got coinage that represented a chicken or a pig. They revived the idea of currency. And so I didn't need the Lord to make money. And everybody started moving from the farms to what were called the burgs, the cities. And they were called burghers, or in France, they were called the bourgeois. All right? They were the middle class. We had the middle class arose that moved to the cities and performed services so the Lord wasn't needed. You know why we moved to the cities? I'll tell you. Kent Hansen, let me explain. The Vikings. Kent, would you stand up? I just want to show them why the Middle Ages decayed. Right there, turn around. There he is. All right. Thank you, Kent Hansen. An ancient, what were you, Dane or a Swede or a Norwegian? My bad, I'm sorry. It was a Norwegian, okay. All the Vikings came down, and you didn't want to be out on land to have Kent show up naked. They fought naked, all right. And so you fled to the burg, all right, and you built way up high a castle so you could throw things down at Kent. Okay. And so the Vikings pressed you all into places like this, and in times the Muslims that came out by the 7th or 8th century. And so all of those things took prestige away from the land, and something else happened, the Black Death. It killed off all the men. So now you could be a man, and well, not just men, everybody. You could now work. You didn't have to, so you had supply and demand. You could now demand wages. And if that lord didn't want to pay you, you could go over here because there wasn't any men to go around. And so all of these things led to it. And what happened is you got this once again. You know how these guys, they comprise the politicians. These guys were the guys that worked for them. When you didn't have land, you know what you did? You did what was called taxation. Because these guys were now in control, and so they would tax. What does absolute power do? Corrupts absolutely. What do you think would happen when these guys made these guys pay them money to rule them? Same as happened in Rome and in Greece. It got corrupted. And the church had to make a decision. Which do you think the church would go with? Taking care of the little guy or being paid by the big guy? The church went with the big guys. As a matter of fact, the church was the largest feudal society. The church owned more land than anybody else, thanks to the Holy Roman Empire. They owned more land. And that, incidentally, is why in the church they ordered celibacy. Because they didn't want these priests having all these kids that would form feudal kingdoms that could rebel against the Pope. And so they did a social vasectomy. I just invented that term right there. It's called celibacy. I'm not going to let you have any kids. And that way you're still going to need us. And so the church threw in with these guys. And that is why years later there was a Russian Jew. And his name was Karl Marx. And he observed that the pattern of history by the 1700s was that these guys would dominate these guys, the haves and the have-nots. These were the minority, these were the majority, and they would control the work. And that society would move through evolutions in politics by the tensions in classes. And he felt that the purpose of the church was to be loyal to the moneyed class and to keep the lower classes, the proletariat, the bourgeois, to keep them manageable. And so he called religion that which would stupefy and make the masses easy to handle. He called it religion is the opiate of the people. That's where that came from. Marx made some bad conclusions from some right observations. He saw what was there. There was bad stuff happening. And he just felt that the ultimate solution was not God. He was a materialist. He didn't believe in God. He felt that someday the proletariat would rebel, destroy the ruling class, and everything would be communal. And these guys would be ruled by some of their own for a while until the system would dissolve into rational, full love. And that communal system was called communism. Communism is a Christian heresy. It was an attempt to produce Christian morals without Christ. It didn't do real well. It fell apart. As did Nazi socialism, National Socialism, as Europe today. So that's why I've done all this morning. I wanted you to see the context. This is not a nice little paragraph. This is utopia. This is Oz. This text is radioactive. It's the cause of what is called Republicans and Democrats. These guys saying, let government back out and let rich be rich, poor be poor. And these guys over here are saying, no, government has to intervene to keep an equanimity to it. We fight in what do you call them, whatever? It's robo-boxers here, sometimes without hearts, trying to bring about liberty, fraternity, and equality to this thing down here. But you can't do it. You can't bring about godly ends in fallen men. God has to change their hearts. See? Well, give me another incidentally on this. During this time of taxation and abuse, when feudalism broke down, you didn't control by land and pigs and chickens. You controlled by taxation, by the politicians under the authority of the church. You saw a couple of things evolve. There was a book that was written that was a political statement. And it was about a king named John who took over because his brother Richard was removed from the land. And he had a guy under him in Nottingham that was the sheriff. And there was a lower class guy that he was a higher class guy named Robin of Locksley. And this guy had taken what was his. And he had to go to a forest named Sherwood. And he got him a bunch of men who were merry. All right. And they took from the rich and gave to some poor, undeserving slob. All right. That was on Bugs Bunny. That's why I remember it. And that is where Robin Hood came from. Is a rich guy that became a poor guy and didn't like it and got to fight the injustice waiting for the second coming of his king. Okay. And also something else evolved right here. Robin Hood was a political book, making a political statement that this stuff is wrong. And we're about to have a proletariat uprising here if you don't do something. You had the priests were not generally amenable to the lower classes, so you had the evolution of a group of guys called fratres, means brothers. They weren't priests. They wore robes, tied ropes around themselves, and they cared not for these guys like the priests, these guys as brothers. There were Augustinian, there were Franciscans, they were brothers of the poor. Who was Robin Hood's sidekick? Friar Tuck. That's where the friars came from. During the Black Death, 10,000 Franciscan friars died taking care of dying people. And so it was like a parachurch movement in this disparity of rich and poor and abuse that tried to bridge the gap between the church and the poor. Isn't that interesting? Led by a guy named, who was the Francis of the Franciscans? Francis of Assisi. Yeah, that was your first hippie. He was. I like it. Well, are you with me so far? Okay. So you remember this distantly in those cliff notes. And you're going, I missed that question, but I saw that movie. Okay. We had this disparity and this, incidentally, Catholicism of the Middle Ages fit perfectly into the disparity. You had sacerdotalism. Pope, priest operated here, and the peons drafted on them into heaven. They enforced this feudalism. Well, we had the thing called a Protestant Reformation. Biggest thing ever occurred in Western civilization. Christ and then the Reformation. Okay. And then Immanuel Kant. Read that on your own. But it was an explosion. And the Protestant Reformation theologically brought the peons up to be priests. Everybody had the priesthood of the believer. Amen. All justified by faith, all approached God. You got rid of the priesthood, rid of the Pope, rid of these guys, and you had pastors over local churches. Well, Reformation society. How are you going to make this theological, ecclesiastic thing go? And they did. In the early Reformation churches, you had the priest would be up here, and then you would have a big iron grating to keep the people away from him. Reformation churches cut that grating out and removed it. You took the communion elements that were back here so you couldn't get to them. I moved them right here. How many of you grew up in a church with the communion elements put right in front of you with a table that had something on it in remembrance of me? And now everybody could come, and the pastor was like a father at the table. We all came, see. And so how are you going to take this theological, ecclesiastic idea and move it politically and economically? You want to try that? Well, that's what Germany, France, Russia, England, Spain, Portugal, that's what they had to do. What would you do? You think you could pull it off? Well, Germany, they looked for a total reformation of society. They didn't get it, and they had an uprising of the peasants, and they killed the aristocracy, and the aristocracy put them to death. It was called the Peasants' Revolt. It was a Marxian revolution long before Marx, because they didn't see theological stuff filter down into business. So they had a revolt. In France, you had enormous ostentation. When I say the term Louis XIV, what do you think of? You don't think of a man's man right here. You think of a fop. Y'all know what a fop is? Go look it up. Okay. You saw this dandy using all of the French culture's money. See, the Reformation never quite reached France. It almost did. They had a group of French Puritans called Huguenots. And on one evening, St. Bartholomew's Day, they killed 12,000 of them. And they ran them off. Calvin left, went to Switzerland. And so Catholicism stayed there, and essentially old feudalism. Well, in the midst of this ostentation, all these poor guys being taxed by these rich guys, the church never settled in. The Protestant church was run off. There was a lady named Marie Antoinette. Y'all with me? Allegedly the most beautiful woman that ever lived, so they said. And someone made the statement to her and her Louis the whatever husband, the people have no bread. And she made one of the greatest political faux pas of the day. She said, let them eat cake, which means na-na-na-boo-boo. That's tough if you poor guys don't have bread. Eat cake. They always say that revolutions ultimately come down to bread. Well, they had a revolution, the French Revolution, and the proletariat rose up, had some leaders there, the Robespierres and the whatevers, stormed the Bastille, and then what did they do with the aristocracy? They killed them by droves. It was a Marxian revolution long before Marx. The problem is, once they killed them all, the French Revolution, they were going to institute liberty, fraternity, and equality. How are you going to do it? Who's going to institute it? The proletariat did it, and they didn't have a theological base. Their base was Voltaire's atheism. How are you going to get chicken salad from chicken feathers? You can't. The effect cannot be greater than the cause. They didn't have a theological base. All they had was deism at best. And so the guys that took over became worse than the guys that were there. And the whole society collapsed into a bloodbath. And then a little bitty fella stepped in and brought peace. What was his name? Napoleon, who brought the greatest wars Europe had ever seen until that time. You're going to see the same thing in Russia. It's going to fall apart after a revolution. There's no theological base, and a guy steps in called Lenin, and a guy after him called the Man of Steel, whose name was Joseph Stalin. So whenever you don't have a theological base, it becomes Darwinian. And the meanest guy takes over, and the little guys pay. Israel discovered this when they got rid of the law of God and they had the Sadducees take over. Well, that's France. Incidentally, I do a lot of incidentallys on this message right here. Did literature step in? At the time, you had a guy named Victor Hugo. And he wrote a couple of books. One was about the lowest guy in the entire social spectrum, Charles Lawton. Not really. The hunchback who ended up becoming a superhero because of Christ-like character. He laid his life down for the lady. Okay. And then you had a guy named Jean Valjean. Or in Texas, we call him Jean Valjean. Or Jean Square. Sometimes we'll just call him Jean. He was a proletariat. He was a lowly guy that was desperately hungry, and he stole some bread for his family. Got put in prison forever and done wrong. He escaped, and he got broken. Remember how he got broken? A priest showed him grace. Do you know, have you ever heard of a guy in Christian literature called Fenelon or Fenelon? F-E-N-E-L-O-N. It's believed that that's who that priest represented. He was an early, or a French pietist, Puritan. He got broken by the grace of God, and he ended up becoming, through hard work, he became a leader in society, but he was a different leader. He brought love and unity and mercy to all of his people. Christianity flowed down. Victor Hugo, Robin Hood, they're political statements. You know what they're looking for? Acts 4. But they couldn't get it. You can't legislate it. See. Well, how did England do 19 miles away? They had an industrial revolution. England had enormous natural resources. Scottish wool, Welsh coal, and they had now the invention of a word called a factory. Everybody moved off the farm to the cities. And now you didn't need a whole colony of farmers. You could have one housewife that could spin a loom or the like, and all of a sudden you had factories. It turned London into a sweatshop, London's East End, and it produced tremendous tension. No longer did you have feudal lords. Now they were called employers. You ever felt like that under your employer? Be honest, have you ever wanted to kill your employer? You have, because these guys became just as bad as the popes and the feudal lords. They just did it not by land, but by employment. Well, they always said that you would have had an English revolt, just like 19 miles to the east in France, except for the presence of a man. He was an Anglican priest that got converted and began to preach the gospel among the poor. And out of it came the Salvation Army that went into London's East End and did wonderful things. And it kept the country back from revolution by the leavening of the gospel. The guy, what was the priest's name? You ever heard of John Wesley? And he began a parachurch group called Methodism, of English Arminian Puritanism in the hearts of those people. And so they ended up legislating. You also had a great preacher, a 16-year-old that was pretty good, that got to have a church that when it opened its doors on the first day in the Surrey Music Gardens, he had 28,000 people. His name was Charles Haddon Spurgeon, greatest English preacher that's ever lived. And so Wesley, Salvation Army, Spurgeon, and as always in history, an author. Every time this author wrote, he was a former orphan that became wealthy through writing, and everything he wrote had to do with the class struggle of the leaders and the poor, and we gotta find mercy and quit abusing. They would work little boys 12, 14 hours. They did horrible things in the name of money. And this guy, everything he wrote, Christmas Carol, help me out, what else did he write? Tale of Two Cities, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield. Who's the author? Charles Dickens. Hugo in France, Dickens. Robin Hood, Friar Tuck. These are all Les Miserables. These are all artistic men crying out about economics and politics. And every once in a while, you'll have a Spurgeon and a Luther and a Calvin. Incidentally, did Calvin try to bring a unanimity to Geneva? If you know your story, he tried to. And so my point here is this is not a little problem in history. Karl Marx said this is history. This is how it's interpreted. I disagree with him, but his observations were right. There's a problem between workers and owners. Well, you go now to America. Did we have an industrial revolution? Oh, son, we had more natural resources than anybody's ever. We didn't know. Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to the west and said, hey, what's out there? Come tell us. We had enormous natural resources. Now, we didn't have lords and all that stuff, but we did. Did we have factories? And we would go on the East Coast and inward, and we would take what were called immigrants, and we work them worse than feudal guys ever thought of getting working. We abused these guys. And we began to have outcries. And we began to have what were called movies turned out about it. Y'all ever read, let me see, help me out. Not Mice and Men, but Grapes of Wrath. Who is that? Who? Seinfeld. Steinbeck. Was that Steinbeck? Yeah. Great. You know that they wouldn't let Grapes of Wrath come out at first because it was such a push toward unions? That, how are we going to solve this deal? Well, they legislated it in England. Y'all remember a fellow named William Wilberforce? He got rid of something, didn't he? Slavery. Well, over here, we fought a war over it. The white guys fought over the treatment of the slaves. Never happened before in history that the controllers fought together over those who were controlled so they could get rid of the institution. Only time it's ever happened. There was a Christian influence over here. But we had a lot of writings that came out about the abuse of the system, and something came out of it. They were called trade unions. These guys got together and says, unless you change things, we're not going to work. And they said, we'll hire strikebreakers. And then they would hire the Irish to come beat the Italians. Did we have y'all ever heard of Jimmy Hoffa? We had some problems on that. In the 1800s, there were times we called out martial law to take care of America because we had wars breaking out. Same as France, same as Germany. We had law, however. Y'all ever heard of Oliver Wendell Holmes? He said, you have freedom to shout, or to freedom of speech, but you cannot shout in a crowded theater, fire. Your freedom ends where another man's begins. And no, you don't have the right to make that kid work 12 hours. I don't care if it is your business. That human is our business. And so your freedom ends right there. And so America avoided, incidentally, communism came over during the 20s, and it didn't have the stigma. Everybody saw it as a solution to the evils of democracy. And a lot of communism got embedded over here because it was seen that democracy and capitalism was breaking down. There was too much abuse. We couldn't enforce love. We couldn't get this. And so communism started off, and then it kind of died down after Russia. Was there a particular senator in the 1950s that raised a stink about incipient communism? Yeah, called Joe McCarthy. And so just to let you see, America struggled with this, but cooler heads resolved toward collective bargaining and toward what was known as, and I think we were the first to come up with, a minimum wage. And so America had to deal with it. Russia, they were a feudal society. There was a Russian Jew named Karl Marx, and he said the only way we're going to get rid of this is we're going to have the evolution of the proletariat take over. There was a guy named Vladimir Lenin. He said it doesn't have to evolve. We get rid of it by force right now. They were called left-wing Hegelians. Don't worry about it. And he said, we'll just have a revolution. Karl Marx said something very interesting. He said, there's no use having philosophical truth of learning about the dialectic of history moving on ultimately to communism. He said, you have to change the world with it. Campus Crusade, when it started in the 1960s, its Bible cover that it put out was, come help change the world. Communism was big in the 60s because we felt that capitalism had failed with the racism and then all the stuff of the day. So Russia had a revolution in 1917, and communism came out of it. I'm almost done. Are y'all with me? Okay. I'm answering questions or giving answers to which you have no questions. There was a nation set apart from all the rest of these that was a total theological island. They had the infinite personal God, a Bible, and commands to follow their servant God toward loving the little man. What nation was that? Israel. They got corrupted and they seized widows' houses. Their Messiah came and they killed him. That spread into what is called the church. The church today is the ideal society that binds what is bound in heaven and we loose what is loosed. Heaven has a wounded king that gave his life for his people. And so in Christianity, if someone sees his brother or sister without clothing and in need of daily food and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? James, let us love not with word or with tongue, but with deed and with truth. I know that because Teresa had it inscribed on the inside of my ring. Dad, burn it. All right. The Good Samaritan, you give your wine, your oil, your whatever to care for these people. Galatians 1, they only ask us to remember the poor. Zacchaeus, if I have robbed anybody of anything and half that I have, I'll give to the poor. God hath chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith. Let him who steals steal no longer. Rather let him labor, performing with his hands what is good, so that he can share with him who has need. You can't legislate holiness. You dig? You can't do it. You can only create it through Jesus Christ. We're the only guys who can do this. Remember, the church is historic, it is universal, but it's local, the body of Christ. I can't imagine being a Christian outside of the brothers and the sisters. Amen? And that's how the church is meant to operate. By this shall all men know. You can do something nobody else can do. Do not look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. Conclusion: Egypt, Assyria, Greece, Rome, Middle Ages, Germany, France, England, U.S., Russia, they looked for it, but they can't do it because you can't change men's hearts. Everybody looks for it. This familiar to you? Came out in 1972.
I'd like to build the world a home and furnish it with love.
That take you
Grow
back?
apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves.
That became one of the most popular tunes of all time. Because the most popular commercial of all time preceded it. The tune was memorable. Wouldn't you agree? You'll be humming it for a year. And it also was sung by the most wholesome people that ever lived. Look at them. They don't sin. You know what else? It followed the greatest pain. This song came out in 72, the Coke commercial in 69. After World War II, Korea, the Cold War, communism, the wall, nukes, race, drugs, Vietnam, John was dead, Bobby was dead, Martin was dead, riots. We all wanted this. And what did we get? The 70s. We got Watergate. Didn't work. But we all want this. Only the church can do it. What a time to celebrate communion. You that are going to help us, you could step back there. Father in heaven, I pray that we as a church might see the identity of who we are. Those that can have co-union. Us together with God. And our great God can make us loving and sacrificial and sensitive and attentive as a Jean Valjean, as a Tom Joad in Grapes of Wrath, as a Robin Hood, as a Friar Tuck, as a Franciscan, as a Wesleyan, as Spurgeon, as Colonel Booth in the Salvation Army, that we would become sensitive because of our wounded King. The commies would love this. Can't get it. The French atheist would have loved this, but they can't get it. The German liberals and their social gospel would love to get it, but they couldn't. The Catholics would have loved to have gotten it by their sacerdotalism and their feudalism, but they couldn't. And Europe tried it, but they couldn't get it. We can do it because of the Holy Ghost that has regenerated our hearts. And there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor freeman, male nor female, for we are family, brothers and sisters in Christ. And if I got $1, and you got $1, we'll remember now the one cup and the one bread through Jesus Christ. Amen.